So we're going to pick it up here in Genesis 3. Now remember, Genesis 2 was this idyllic paradise, right? You had a very nice natural scene where people had all the food they needed. The relationship between the man and the woman and God, right? The whole community, all three of them was just great. They were naked and unashamed, right? Nobody was ashamed to be who they were. No one thought there was anything wrong with being different. Things were just great. Now also remember that for the ancient Near Eastern people, the closest you could get to the essence of a thing, or if you wanted to understand what something or who someone was, it was their origin. So this is very significant that the Yahwist writers have human beings living in this community of harmony, right, with each other and nature and God. So by doing that, they're saying, this is what we could be. This is who, in other words, we really are. So let's have a look. So we had this paradise and then enter the serpent here. This is when things all start to fall apart. So the serpent is identified as the most cunning of animals in Genesis chapter 3. Now notice here that the serpent is an animal. Right, now this is significant because the serpent was not only the most powerful and terrible monster in the Mesopotamian myths, but the Canaanites had serpent cults, right? Somewhat semi-animistic traditions in which they actually worship the serpents as a god. And again, anything the Canaanites were doing, we can figure that some of the Israelites, who many of whom were former Canaanites, were also doing on some level. So when the Yahwist, that is the scribes of the royal courts, are writing the story and they're saying, hey, the serpent is not a god, he's just an animal created by God, right? They're condemning that the serpent cults and the treating of the state of the serpents, snakes, as some kind of deity or demigods. Okay, so there's another little play on words there. Cunning, arum, and naked, arumim, are sound alike, and therefore, people cue into these things, and the Yahwist writers sure did love a play on words. Okay, so, we're told that the serpent is the most cunning of all the animals, and the serpent is rather cunning in this story. First of all, he doesn't just come out and say, hey, God's wrong. You can eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What does he do? He kind of poses this challenge as a question. He said, did God really say that? This is a great, right? This is a great thing to do if you want to change someone's mind, if you want to confuse or trick someone. You always kind of get them to question, hey, what really happened? And he doesn't pause it as an order as we see it's presented in Genesis 2, but he just says something he said, right? Also, he doesn't call God Yahweh. Now, in the translations here, in the scriptures that we have passed down from the first generation, the first century Jewish community, there's no use of the word Yahweh, right? But the Yahwists probably used the word Yahweh. Later editors were not comfortable with that word because they thought that the name of God was too holy, that it shouldn't be said. So they used Adonai, the Lord. Okay, so when you see the Lord here in our new American Bible Revised Edition, know that probably the original text was Yahweh. All right, and again, use that as a substitution due to reverence for God and the holiness of His name. Right, and so the snake is, did he say any trees? He's just getting them to kind of like, well, think about what he really said. Do you think that's what he really meant? Why wouldn't he let you eat from any of the trees? And then, in other words, he's making it seem like not such a big deal somehow, and getting to kind of question like, what did God really say? What did he really mean? Why did he say it? Stuff like that. So Eve and Burge suggests possibly Adam, that he was there as a silent partner in the whole conversation, starts to show like some confusion and repeats what the snake said. It repeats what the serpent said, so that she's saying say instead of order. Now here we go. Like, her memory, it seems, is being corrupted by the words that the snake is feeding into her head, right? And she starts to not refer to Yahweh by his personal name, right? We know that they have an intimate relationship here. We'll see in the latter half of this chapter, it seems like God regularly comes down and just hangs out with them during the nice part of the day. But she doesn't call him by his name. She calls him God too. So you see there's distances there. Then again, she seems to be getting a little defensive, or maybe her memory's getting thrown off little, because she adds to the account, well, he said don't eat or even touch it. That's not in chapter 2. But it seems like she is confused and getting defensive, and you can see the serpent is quite cunning. So Baird asks the question if there's any significance of the serpent approaching the woman. If there is, she says, it's within the framework of men and women relating as equals in paradise, right? Again, so we were originally created that way. That's our essence, and we could be that way now. Now, that's not necessarily the way it was in the Israelite culture, as we'll see later in the punishments that Adam and Eve receive for eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But it seems, before they choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, men and women are equals. And you see here Eve having the public conversation with the serpent, right? Now, again, this might take some imagination or on your part. It's like you realize that in some cultures, and probably the ancient Israelite culture, which is quite patriarchal in many ways, it wasn't acceptable for a woman to speak in public, in a public conversation, especially if there was a man around, which Burge suggests that Adam was a silent partner in this conversation. So let me give you an example. Like when I was in the Peace Corps, I was in a country called Uzbekistan in Central Asia, and I went on one weekend. I went on a hike and mountain climbing expedition with a few of the other volunteers, and we were pretty far up in the mountains. We stumbled upon this remote farm. There's just this family that farmed in the mountains, miles away from any roads or anything, and they're very hospitable. They took us in and they gave us dinner and they gave us a nice place to sleep and stuff like that. But like when the wife, she had a lot of questions for us because they'd never met anybody from the United States before. And she would ask her questions to her husband. Like she would turn and say it to him, and then he would say it to us. Because, again, in their culture, like it wasn't polite for a woman to talk to men who were not, close to her family somehow. Likewise, when I was teaching at a high school there, one time my counterpart, who was a female teacher, she was giving exams, and one of the male teachers came in, like while one of the students was giving an oral exam, and he just started talking over top of the student, and she just sat there and listened to him, and then he was done and he left, and the student was just rattling on his memorized piece the whole time. And so later I asked her, I was like, why did you let that teacher, interrupt when that student was taking their test? She was the head of the department. And she says, I'm an Uzbek woman. I can't contradict a man in public. She can't interrupt or go against what a man says in public. So they had a lot of cultures have these kind of, a lot of patriarchal cultures have these kind of standards for public speech of women. But you see here, this is not going on in Eden, right? Eve is the one talking. And, Adam later, he doesn't even have much of a intellectual discussion. He just, takes the apple and eats it. So you can see this could be understood as part of Jay's statement of original equality between men and women, right? Okay, so now the serpent, just kind of starts laying it on. He's it loosened up her mind and confused her about what's going on, kind of planted some false memories in some ways. He's just going to start, giving her nonsense. He says, well, you won't die. Well, which is kind of true. They won't die right away, maybe like they think, but they will die a spiritual and emotional death of sorts, and they will eventually die of natural causes or however else they go out. He says, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Again, not real. Not the way that they think, right? They don't understand what this idea of knowing good and evil for themselves really is. And they don't basically trust God at this moment. This is kind of like what the crux of the discussion is. The snake seems to somehow be getting them to think that like God is trying to keep something from them, like God doesn't want them to be as knowledgeable as Him or something. And so this is where they're becoming very susceptible to a lot of trouble and hardship here. As Burge say, the couple's desire to conduct their life independently of the Creator's guiding wisdom is what leads them to, eat of this tree. It's kind of like they want to know everything for themselves, without God. Or another way to put it is that they fail to trust God's goodness, or fail to trust the goodness that created them, right? God told them, don't eat from this tree, and from what they know, from their own experience, God loves them, God's their friend. God gave them all this great stuff, God created them for each other. God gives them this paradise to live in. They really don't have much reason not to trust God. And again, the funny thing is, we'll learn it later in the chapter that He hangs out with them every day. I always wonder, why didn't Eve just say, well, okay, I'm a little confused right now. I'm going to wait to talk to God about it. Right? Wouldn't that have been a good move? Again, we can see the spiritual sense in this text here, where, hey, this is helping us to think about the big decisions we're making in our own life. They don't trust, what God said. They think maybe God's trying to keep something from them here. And, well, that's kind of when stuff all starts to fall apart. Okay, so what happens when they eat the fruit? Well, they don't die. They just don't really live anymore, right? Not like they used to. And they do gain a kind of autonomous knowledge. And Burge doesn't really put it this way, but I'll argue that it's a corrupted knowledge, right? They're not really seeing things clearly anymore. They know good and evil, but their judgment of what's good and evil is wrong. It's off, right? Now, when they trusted God and they had an intimate relationship with God about what was good and evil, their judgment and their vision was much clearer. Okay? So now they're naked and now they're ashamed, right? It's a little bit different. What's once seen as good is now seen as bad. Again, it's not that Adam and Eve's condition of their nakedness changed, right? They're still open, but now they're somehow ashamed of that, right? They're somehow afraid to be open. They want to cover things up. They want to hide a little, right? They're not sharing intimately with each other and God anymore, right? So we can see this as a sign of kind of alienation, a self-alienation from the community, right? They hide from God, and when God comes down in the breezy part of the day, suggesting that He did this every day, right? They hide. And when God says, why are you hiding? And they say, it's because they're naked. And He's like, what? Who told you that? And Eve, immediately blames the snake as Adam blames Eve. And Adam even blames God. He's like, the woman, the one you put here, she gave me the fruit. So you can see that they don't have this intimacy, trust, and loving relationship here. It's getting to be a relationship of alienation, fear, distrust, wanting to hide things from each other. Again, this is kind of the J writer seeing, this is where we're at. This is the world we're kind of living in. But it's not who we originally are. It's not really our essence. In other words, things could be different. Okay, so if we move on to the punishments, we again have to read these canonically. And we already talked about this with Abel a little bit. Punishment of God, we can't really take it as something as God getting angry and lashing out at someone. But we can probably understand it more like consequences that God allows us to suffer so that we can learn to be more like Him, right? So that we can learn to find that union with Him through learning to love like God. And at a basic level, these punishments function as an etiology. God curses the snake and says he's going to have to crawl around on his belly. So it tells us why snakes don't have legs, right? It tells us why women are dominated by men, right? In Eden, woman was not dominated by men. In Eden, Eve spoke freely to the serpent. Maybe that wasn't true in 9th century BC Israel, right? Also tells you why women have pain in childbirth. These are just answering questions like, why is it like this? Why is it like that? Right? It tells you why men have to work so hard to farm the land. Now remember, when these stories were originally getting written down around 1000, this was also when a lot of Israelites were kind of converting from a herding lifestyle to a farming lifestyle and kind of settling down around the newly formed Israelite cities, especially Jerusalem. And there was like a tough period there for a lot of people and say, geez, I've been doing this. Like, how do we do this? Right? How do we do this farming thing? Right? So especially in the South, most Israelites were probably not used to farming. And also you had pretty arid areas. So even for people who were experts, it took a lot of work. Right? The ground's not that easy to cultivate. And then also, just a basic question, why do we die? Why do people die? That's a basic human question. And this gives an answer. This story gives an answer to it. Again, there's certain warnings for the people from Jay. And one is that sin has consequences, right? You see here, when you go against, or in this case, let's say when you stop trusting God, when you kind of try to go your own way, things can get bad, right? So you have to... you're wise to incorporate God in your decisions, right? And then for them, a practical way that this was applied was, not listening to foreign cults. Again, a lot of these foreign cults were worship snakes. It was a primary symbol of a lot of the Canaanite religions. So again, like, hey, don't listen to a snake for them. Meant don't join these foreign cults. Don't listen to their priests and priestesses, right? You see that in the perpetual hostility with the offspring with Eve, right? They say, so it's like never, right? It's like these cults are always bad. These cults are always going to lead you into trouble. For the kings of Israel, this was a special warning too, because the kings would marry princesses from other tribes, non-Israelite tribes, in order to make treaties with them. And when they came, they always brought their gods, including their snake gods. And it was kind of a sign like, okay, like these, your foreign wife is going to do this stuff, but remember that, God, Yahweh, has to be on top of that. You can't listen to that stuff, right? You have to let it be known that Yahweh is God in Israel. So now they are going to be expelled from the Garden of Eden, and Adam is going to give Eve a new name. Notice he's already taking over kind of a dominant role now. Before he named her Isha, out of Ish, from Ish. And it kind of was a sign of their equality or unity, right? Their equal dignity. Now he's going to name her Ava, Eve, right? Woman alive. And, there's kind of a different life now, a different name for different life. They've died an emotional and spiritual death in a lot of ways. And now they've got this new life that is not as good as their old life, right? It's kind of like the opposite of the religious message. And we can see, in Christianity, we talk about our new life. We're kind of going back to paradise, so to speak, right? Now, God is not abandoning them, right? That's one of the things that probably they thought was going to happen now, and oh my gosh, God's going to reject us. God's there with them, right? He still cares for them, and he shows this by giving them clothes. So the way that Burge talks about it is that they're expelled to a life where their relationship with God and one another will continue to be affected by their failure to trust God and their grab for knowledge that God alone has the maturity to wield, right? Interesting way to talk about it. This is a very interesting creation myth, and people do take it in various levels. Like a lot of people would be like, this just says obey God. They'll take it a very you have a command, you have to follow it, and some people even take it to a point where it's like anti-intellectual, right? Where they use it to suppress reason or something, and they'll use it as a validation for blind faith. It doesn't seem in keeping with the whole of the Israelite tradition or scriptures, but there's definitely something here with the acknowledgement that trying to understand things without God's help or a divine vision won't really work out, right? Just the idea, so to speak, that you could know what's good and bad, right? That kind of know good and evil for yourself, that doesn't really work, right? Like you might know what you think is good for you now or good for your family now, but we can't really tell what's good in the end, can we? Right? We can tell what we want, but do we know what's really good for us? Do we know how things are going to work out in the end? I mean, haven't you ever had something happen to you in your life and you thought this is the worst thing for me, but then it turned out to actually be good for you in the end? So the idea that as humans we could see the long game, see the future, and understand how everything's going to work out, it's not really true, is it? In that way, the knowledge of good and evil is kind of a lie from the beginning. So at the end here, God places the cherubim, these 6 winged mythical creatures that were believed in all over the ancient Near East. They're in everybody's mythologies, and he puts them in the entrance, in front of the entrance to the Garden of Eden, with the flaming sword. And the flaming sword, Bird says, represents lightning, which was understood as an expression of God's anger, or God's disapproval of something, that he might strike it with lightning. Now, just a little reflection. I've already hinted at a little, but I want to go into it more. And again, this I can understand that this is not quite maybe to the level of historical critical analysis of the text. It's going a little bit with a spiritual analysis, because I can't claim that, hey, this is how, this is the original intention of the authors. I'm not claiming the priestly writers were saying, we're taking it to the extent that I'm going to take it now, with trusting God and the knowledge of good and evil. But you do see the idea that they're definitely saying, there's something with the human sin that has to do with not trusting in God. That's kind of in some ways what turns our life from paradise into a very rough and hostile and alienated life. Okay, so my question is, could the knowledge of good and evil be a kind of ignorance? That is, that it's a facade from the beginning. Again, like I said already, could it be that human beings don't actually have the capacity to know good and evil in the long run, right? In other words, could it mean judging things for ourselves? Kind of like what Burge was saying about not trusting the goodness of God, right? Could the knowledge of evil, right, represent thinking that some of the things that God gives us are evil, right? Now, in the Garden of Eden, didn't it seem like everything was good, right? In the first creation account, which is written later by the priestly source, didn't they interpret it that way? Didn't they say, based on their Israelite tradition, of which the second creation account was a big part of, didn't they didn't they also think like, yeah, like God created everything good? That certainly seems to the picture. So where was the evil, right? The knowledge of good and evil, where was that? Right? Well, then the idea that something that God created could be evil, maybe that's the sin in itself, right? So you see Adam and Eve are naked and unashamed, and then all of a sudden, after they've eaten from the fruit of the knowledge from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they are naked and ashamed, right? Them being naked didn't change. What happened? The way that they saw being naked changed, right? They started to think being naked is wrong, right? Maybe it's because they thought, hey, being different is wrong, right? They took the things that God gave them, they took the gifts that God had provided them, and they started to judge them. And instead of judging them all as good as they had before, they just kind of had this intuitive trust in God. Now they're starting to doubt that, and they're thinking, oh, maybe God gives us evil things. Okay, so perhaps original sin is thinking and judging without remembering how much God loves us, without remembering that God has this intimate and loving relationship with us. Right? I mean, if you look at the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, or the realization of saints like Saint Teresa of Lisieux, you'll see that in a certain way, perhaps maybe they had re-entered Eden, right? Because they saw the world a lot like Adam and Eve in paradise. Everything had a purpose. Everything was a gift of God somehow.